culture was going to disappear in about 15 years. So now 10, 11 years from now. And by that time, I knew that most of these divers were in their 70s, 80s, early 90s. And the thing is if you want to interview people who are in their late 80s, early 90s, you take a big risk waiting 5, 10, or 15 years. So all of a sudden, this became really important that I do it now, while I still could, or while, everybody was still around that would have had the longest amount of history on the island. Anyway, when I started, like I said, I was really inspired by their physical courage. And over time, while I still remained inspired by that, I really was more inspired, I think, by their psychological courage, endurance, bravery, persistence. And one of the things I have found talking to book clubs is a big difference between last year when the book was in hardcover and this year, now that it's in paperback. And the book came out in paperback, I think on March 12th. They had a 6-week tour prepared for me. I went out for 5 days, 5 states, 5 planes in 5 days, and then they sent me home, thank goodness. But what I've noticed since then is that when I talk to book clubs or events like this, that people have been this year, much more inspired by their sort of psychological courage. That we're all living through something that's really extraordinary right now. And if you think about what these people on this island have lived through, Japanese colonial period, World War II, the 4-3 incident, the Korean War. We're so lucky in this country that, at least looking, around here, I don't think there's anybody on this screen who was alive when we had the last war on this soil, the Civil War. So we don't really have that experience of having a battle or a skirmish happening right outside our windows, right outside our front doors. But right now we are living through this other kind of extraordinary situation. And at least, anyway, like I said, what I've been finding is that people have, in this time period, have been more inspired by their sort of psychological courage more than their physical courage.
So we're just going to open this up. If anyone has questions, if you go down to participants, there's a raise your hand button, or if you want to just wave at me, we can do that too. Questions?
Well, you're so shy. Cheryl, but you have to unmute yourself.
I was struck by the terrible cruelty in the 4-3 incident. And now, were these Koreans? I mean, these were Koreans against Koreans under the Americans' watchful eye, committing all those atrocities?
Yes, and actually, the atrocities that happened during this time, during the 4-3 incident, are considered to be some of the worst that have ever been recorded. So as bad as what happens in the book, let's just say I was sort of at the B- level, because I mean, I certainly learned the things that were done, but I felt like they were too much to include.
Was it the fear of communism that motivated them? Or?
I mean, you have to remember the time period and after the Korean War, and although the United States and Russia had been allies during World War II, certainly as soon as the war was over, it was just a whole different idea, and there was this sense of the domino theory, and people were just really worried about communism, not just in Korea, but around the world.
Right.
And but let me just say that while there were some of these kids who I suppose today you could say were like communist sympathizers, that's really not what this was about overall. I mean, these were peasants mostly who wanted, how it initially started was, the North and South are divided after World War II. The United States has administrative control over the South. And we said to people, great news, we're letting you're gonna get to have your own free elections. And that would have been the first time that there would have been free elections on the peninsula. But there was some small print, which was there was only one candidate and we chose him. He won, obviously, and he became a brutal dictator for the next 50 years. So in the lead up to the 4/3 incident was really about people wanting to have their own vote, wanting to choose their own candidates.
Right.
And it's like, I'm saying that and I feel like I'm watching the news right now. These issues of voting. But they just wanted to, select their own candidates and be able to vote freely. And that's exactly what we, the people who were in charge in that time, were not allowing. And so while a lot of the people were kind of labeled as being communist, it was really more about wanting democracy, wanting exactly what we were saying we were offering them, which was democracy. Wanda?
Lisa, a couple of questions have come up about people are interested in how you got started as a writer.
Oh, sure. So I don't know if you guys know this, but my mother was a writer, and my mother's father, my grandfather, was also a writer. That's on my mother's side. And then on my father's side, that's the Chinese side of my family. And my father's an anthropologist. So I feel like, I really am a blending of my mother and father, one a writer, one an anthropologist.
Okay, Cindy has a question. I'm going to unmute her.
I'm looking for Cindy. There you are.
Well,
I thought it was rather strange that the Americans let the Japanese be in so control. I mean, they had all these Japanese collaborators
You mean
after the 4/3.
Japanese colony?
Well, after World War II, it just seemed like they were absolutely clueless about what was going on in the culture. And is that what you found too?
I just started a book club. That's what I came in to tell you. Okay. So I'm sorry, that was my husband coming in for a second.
It's okay.
So who was clueless? The United States was clueless?
Yes, they had absolute idiots in charge. I guess it's kind of like,
if we've had any experience.
I won't go there, but there may be similarities.
The thing is, I mean, while it was a Japanese colony, Japan was very aggressive in the Pacific, and it didn't start with World War, the bombing of.
Oh, right.
First, they had Korea as a colony. Then they invaded China during the Sino-Japanese War. And then on December 7th is when they, bombed Pearl Harbor. But on December 8th, because of the international dateline, they invaded all different all kinds of countries all across the Pacific Rim. So we hadn't done much of anything in the lead up, obviously, even to Pearl Harbor, that we weren't paying attention. It wouldn't be the first time that we weren't paying attention to the kinds of, intelligence that people find and gather. I mean, the same thing happened with 9/11, right? I mean, they had the intelligence, just nobody did anything about it.
It seems strange to me that they just sort of gave it to the Japanese, who lost the war. I mean, we were supposedly bitter enemies.
The Japanese were pushed out after the war. It just took a little while to get them all off there. it's estimated that there were about 250,000 troops on Jeju. So they couldn't just
Whoa.
jump off on one boat. You know, this had to be a really long project to get everybody off. And then the other thing is that so many of those, of that 250,000, almost all of them were living underground in caves and in these
Lava tubes.
and so it just took a long time. I mean, just logistically to get them all off the island.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, and you know why? It's because when the course of the war started to shift and the Japanese government thought, okay, you know, we might lose, the anticipation was that the United States was going to invade through Jeju. In other words,
Right.
use it as a stepping stone to get to Japan. And so that's why they had so many people stationed on the island, was to, you know, this was going to be their last stronghold. You know, that this is the wall to keep people from invading. You know, it's just another 100 miles to Japan. And of course, nobody knew about the atomic weapons that we were going to use. So that, you know, that was the anticipation, was that the United States would come through Jeju to get to Japan.
Thank you.
And now we have a question about the two primary women characters. Were those composites of women you interviewed in the research for your book, or did they, you know, were they distinct characters who you knew, who you came across?
No, I mean, they're characters I created. I mean, certainly I use stories that people told me, but they are not, I wouldn't go so far as to say that they're composite characters. I mean, I'll tell you how I started thinking about them. Pretty early on, I came across the aphorism that said, if you plant red beans, you'll raise red beans. And this kind of idea of, I think of as like the little kids, how they get kind of a stamp on their forehead. You know, you meet somebody and think, he's going to grow up to be a doctor. Look, he's going to grow up to be a nuclear physicist or whatever. You know, some kids, you just see that. Well, when I was in elementary school, there was a little boy in our class, Earl Eddy. And we all thought this kid, I mean, we were like in 3rd grade, but we all knew he was going to end up in prison. I mean, it was just like, you know, I guess that name, Earl Eddy, it's just like, well, he's gone to prison. And so then you jump ahead about 40 years. And I was having some work done on my house by a handyman. And he didn't show up one day, but he sent somebody to do whatever the work was. And I was talking to this guy and like, oh, you grew up in Topanga? I grew up in Topanga. Oh, you had Mr. Lust for your 6th grade teacher? So did I. And then finally it was like, we realized we were in the same class. I said, so what's your name? Earl Eddy. This was his first job out of prison. So anyway, I just think, so when I was thinking about Young-suk, I was thinking how she's the daughter of the chief of the collective. It's kind of expected that she'll grow up and take her mother's place. And of course she does. It's just a much harder journey than you think it's going to be at the beginning. But she has this kind of positive stamp on her forehead. And then you have Mija, who's the daughter of Japanese collaborators. And she also has this stamp on her forehead, but it's like, do not trust this person. She's not reliable. And so I was really thinking about those ideas of that kind of stamp, but also, you know, I've written a lot over the years about fate and destiny, and this time I was really thinking about free will, and can free will change what is your expected fate and destiny?
And now Darcy has raised her hand and would like to ask a question. Darcy, do you want to, there you go.
There you are. I have
Hi.
to look, I'm looking for you.
I'm up here at the top.
Now you're on, in my screen, you're on the bottom.
Yeah. I wondered, in doing your research, did you ever come across any other matrifocal cultures? And if so, do they exist today?
There actually is a matriarchy in China. This is the Muso people. And that's a true matriarchy. So, you know, the difference between a matrifocal society focused on women and a matriarchy is, in a matriarchy, the women own the property, the women pass their property on to their daughters. And they're real, I mean, I'm sure there's some other ones in the world. I think there are a couple in Africa that are still matriarchies. I think there are other cultures that are matrifocal, but I don't know them off the top of my head. The only ones I know of for sure are the Muso.
I had heard that the Papua New Guinea people were matrilineal.
So any other questions?
Linda has it. And Linda, just unmute yourself.
I was wondering, what was the instance, or is there a percentage on ladies dying with diving? Because it just seems so risky.
It was very risky. And today there are about 4,000 left, and about 10 a year die in diving accidents. So, you know, either that's a lot or it's not many, but that's what, 1 out of every 400.
Do you think it would have been more years ago versus now, where they have the bodysuits and the goggles?
Yeah, I think it was much more in the past. First of all, because of the cold, you know, now they have wetsuits. Back then they didn't. There are a lot of, you know, the thing is, you know, if you go back far enough, there's not a lot of real research. It's more anecdotal, but lots of stories of women, you know, jumping into the water and dying on impact because the water was so cold, it just stops their hearts. So, you know, that's obviously one way, and probably one of the main was through cold. But other things, I think they're just as common, although today they don't do that deep sea, you know, they're not going to Vladivostok, you know, they don't do that away, you know, that itinerant work, because they're not very many of them, and they don't want to travel, you know, and I don't think the world is set up anymore for that kind of work from them. But things like an underwater surge, sharks, being hit by a boat. I mean, actually being hit by a boat now is greater than it was in the past. Getting a cut, you know, or getting tangled in, you know, harvesting in abalone was and still is one of the main ways that women die.
And we have a question about, she's curious about the interview and the interview process. What did that look like, and were there any particularly memorable moments during those interviews?
So I really divide them up in my mind into 3 groups. The first were these very in-depth interviews that would last 2 to 8 hours in someone's home. Then the next was, I would go to where women were going into the sea in the morning and when they were coming out in the evening. And, you know, these are working women, right? And they were busy, both going in and coming out. So, and they're very blunt and they're very loud because their ears have been so damaged by being under the sea. And so, you know, I'd say, oh, can I talk to you for a few minutes? And sometimes it was like, sure, sit down. And other times like, no, go away, we're busy. So those interviews tended to be quite shorter, sort of 5 to 30 minutes. But one of the great things about those shorter interviews is, first of all, I can get one great line. You know, I remember one woman saying to me, you know, and I used it in the book, you know, I was so good under the sea, I could cook a meal under there. And I was like, oh, write it down. I'm done. My work is done for the day. But the other is to help build a consensus. So very early in the trip, there was a woman I was talking to, and let me just say, you know, I am a woman. We have our unique biology. And so for most of my books, you know, when I've been out interviewing people, I'll ask, like, what happens when you get your period? How do you take care of yourself? When you're pregnant, you know, are there certain foods you're allowed to eat or not allowed to eat, things you're allowed to do, not allowed to do? What do you wish for when you're pregnant? What are the traditions around childbirth? Anyway, I was talking to this one woman, and again, early on the trip, and she was saying, oh, you know, I just love to be in the water when I was like 8, 9 months pregnant, you know, really big, because the water gave me so much buoyancy. And it just sort of took away, you know, just took that weight off. She said, but you know, nothing was as great as when I was really pregnant and was diving in Vladivostok in winter. You know, I not only had the buoyancy, but that freezing cold water took away all my aches and pains. And I just sort of was like, are you pulling my leg? You know, because it just seemed like, oh, there's no way I would do that. But then I could ask other people in these short interviews, like, when you were pregnant, did you ever go to Vladivostok? What did you, and then when you hear it over and over and over again, all of a sudden it really confirms this wasn't just one aberration, you know, one woman saying it. This was something that women wanted. And then the other thing that kept coming up, and I would ask, you know, what's the one thing you wished for when you were pregnant? And usually when you ask that question, people will say, I just wanted my baby to be healthy, you know, to be born healthy. But these women all said the same thing. They just wished to have their baby in the field. And in the field meant in the water while they were diving. And if you couldn't have your baby in the water while you were working, you know, you'd go up on the boat for the last 1 or 2 hours of labor, have your baby there, and then be back in the water 2 days later. And so that, you know, those were the kinds of things I really got out of those short interviews. And then the third group were these women who are semi-retired or retired or getting over an injury, who sit on the beach and gather and sort the algae and seaweed that's washed ashore overnight. I love these women. I just loved them so much. And I did not have a plan initially to have a part of the book that was set in current times, but I loved them so much that, as you know, the book opens with an old woman on the beach sorting the algae and seaweed that's washed ashore.
And Darcy has another question.
As a scuba diver, I loved your descriptions of being under the water. And I wondered if you're a scuba diver too, or did you take that from your interviews?
I'm not a scuba diver, but I did speak to a scuba diving group a couple of weeks ago, which was pretty interesting, that they'd all read the book, and they had very different questions than I usually get. But I'm not, and a lot of it I got from just talking to the women, from video and documentaries, and then also my own terror of doing that work. I mean, just in my pool, I would try to practice getting that head down, exact straight head down position. I never was able to master it. I mean, I really tried. So that, you know, I like air. I mean, just that whole idea of running out of air under the water, and I when I was a little kid, of course, we used to go to Disneyland, and I clearly am nervous about being under the sea, because we used to do the submarine ride, and I would sit right up against the little porthole so I could see the sky above, which was only like a foot above, right? We weren't really under the sea, but I'm nervous about that. So I was able to, I think, incorporate a lot of my own fears.
So another question about writing. When you write and you choose your topic, do you do you know, like, do you have an outline that you know the beginning, the middle, and the end, or do you create as you go?
I have an outline. I write the last line first, so I know where I'm going to end emotionally. I mean, it's really about the emotion of where I'm going to end. I may not know how I'm going to get there. I usually start with about a 7-page outline, and then it grows as I do the research.
Any other questions, people?
Cheryl, unmute yourself.
Lisa, do you have research assistants that assist you with the research?
No.
No, you do it all yourself.
My favorite part. I love it. I mean, I mean, to me, it's like a big treasure hunt. I never know what I'm going to find. And I mentioned, Death by Abalone, I mean, when I read that, I was just like, oh, Death by Abalone. We're going to have that in this book. Woo-hoo! And then for me, it's like a matter of where does it go? Is it at the beginning, middle? Is it at the end? Why is it there? What are the repercussions? So it's not just to use it to be morbid, but it was just like, wow, I've got to use that. And so, if somebody else was doing the research, I don't know if they would have that same reaction. I know that there are a lot of writers who use not just one researcher, but teams of researchers. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, for me, that's the most fun part. So why would I let somebody else do it? I mean, I do have a young woman who, they've been different ones over the years, students from UCLA who work for me about 10 hours a week. Sometimes I'll say, oh, could you go to the UCLA Research Library and bring me back 10 books on fill in the blank. But, and then, I'm the one who looks through them, and then that can send me to the next thing or the next thing. But I could never give that part up because I just love it so much.
Thank you.
So the dwindling number of the Hanyu, do they like wish that their daughters, their granddaughters would go into it, or do they realize that it's a dwindling career?
So, just to remember that it's not until 1978 that girls could go to public school. It's just so shocking to me. And even that required fees. And so these women started saving up their money to send their daughters to school, and daughters and their granddaughters. And so those women, they went to elementary school, junior high, high school, college, university. They became doctors. They became engineers. They work in the tourism business. They are teachers, they're librarians. They don't have to do that. They work in factories, they work in offices. They don't have to do that truly dangerous work that their mothers and grandmothers did. And so while I do think that there's, let's just say, kind of bittersweet, right? I mean, I think these women are so proud of their daughters and granddaughters, or all their children, that they have put through school. And the sacrifices that were required to do that. So that's the sweet part. And the bittersweet part, of course, is that they know that this culture will disappear. But I think they'd much rather see their, their descendants in a safe, doing safe, being literate, I mean, what a huge thing just to be literate. And I think their daughter, that these women are very proud of their daughters and granddaughters for what they've accomplished, even though it's a little bittersweet.
And can you talk about the editing process? How much are you edited when you turn in a book?
It really depends on the book, and it depends on the editor. and each editor has a different style. Some books, you know, the editing is very smooth. There's very little. With Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane and Island of Sea Women, barely any editing, maybe a month took me. I mean, just not very much. The one that I'm just finishing now had a really pretty major revision. And, you know, I just yesterday finished the first go through, and it took me about 2 months, maybe 3. And today I started back on page 1. So the process for this book is going to take much longer than for the other ones. And who knows why that happens, you know. Sometimes I'm just not very good, I guess. I mean, or, you know, I don't know. I don't know what it is. I wish I had a better understanding of it, because with the Island of Sea Women, my editor did say to me, and other readers too would say, like, oh, this is so mature. So, well, thank you. Nobody really wants to be mature, but you know, I took that as a really great compliment, because I felt that myself as I was writing it, like, I know what I'm doing. And with this new one, I thought, oh, so now it's going to be like that forever. Turns out, no, it wasn't. and yeah, this one has been a little more of a challenge.
How long did the research process take for Island of Sea Women? And did the medical study actually take place?
So most of the books take about 2 years. The research takes the longest amount of time. The writing is actually the shortest, and editing is in the middle. With the scientists, one of the first things I found were these studies that had been done mostly in the 1950s through the early 1970s, although there have been a couple after that. I probably looked at about 20 different studies, and they were, you know, one was published in the Journal of Headaches. Who knew that even existed? Another one was on their thyroid. Another, there was another couple that were more, what's the word I'm looking for? More about their bones and their hip, like the damage that the weights have done to their hips. So I don't know what that would be. But then most of them, the majority of them, were about this question of, you know, why is it that these women can handle this cold? You know, they had the greatest ability of any human group on Earth to withstand cold water, which is harder than cold air. And so, there were many, many studies about this, looking at all the different reasons. One, and this is, somebody got money to do this study, was looking to see, could there be a genetic relationship between these women and the Weddell seal? And you know what, wouldn't have had to pay me anything, and I could have told them no. But anyway, it turned out no, they didn't. So the thing is I couldn't give you the results of those studies in the book because they hadn't happened yet. But what I will tell you is that I love that material so much, but there was really no way for me to get it into the book, because those women, they didn't know about their temperature. They didn't, you know, again, they were illiterate. They weren't educated. And so, you know, I love that material so much that Dr. Park came with his people. I can tell you that there was in the outline, I thought that they were going to have an affair, you know, that he would come every year, and every year they'd meet at the hotel, you know, like same time next year kind of thing. I even wrote a sex scene, and I was like, type. Oh, no, this can't be happening. No. So it just felt so wrong. So even though it was in the outline, by the time I got to that scene, Young Suk's character was so developed, and her feelings about her husband and everything were so developed, that there was no way she was going to have sex with Dr. Park. And so that scene just lives on my computer.
And we have a question about the island of Jeju itself. What is the weather like? What is it like geographically? Any highlights? I guess what would it be like in the US?
So it looks and feels a lot like Hawaii. I mean, it is considered the Hawaii, the Hawaii of Asia. It's like a big honeymoon spot for couples all around Asia. It has a big tourism industry, lots of golf resorts, things like, I mean, it's just very much like Hawaii. It looks a lot like Hawaii. It's a big volcano in the middle. Lots of palm trees, lots of volcanic rock. It is extraordinarily windy. So, like in Hawaii, there's certain islands and towns that are on one side of the island are super windy. And then on the other side, it's pretty calm. The same thing happens here. The other thing with the island is the north side is much colder and gets a lot of snow. But on the other side, it's almost like beach towns in Southern California. It really has that look, actually, like being in Laguna Beach kind of thing. So, and very temperate, they grow oranges there. I mean, it's, the climate changes in all these different parts of the island. There's snow almost all year round on the top of the volcano. The volcano historically has been a place where people have come to practice climbing Everest. It's not nearly as high, but it's rugged enough, and some of the terrain is very similar to what you would find on Everest.
Did you know much about Korean life during the time periods portrayed before you wrote the book?
No. And in fact, that was part of the thing that so interested me in why I set it during the time period that I did, because I didn't know that it had been a Japanese colony. I was very confused about the Korean War. I have a theory about this, which was when I was a kid, by the time we got to the Korean War, it was the end of the year. It was like June, and the teachers were tired. I think my teachers were tired. I've had so many teachers say, yep, that's right. And then when I got to high school and college, I think we kind of jumped over the Korean War to get to the Vietnam War, because that's what we were living through right then. So I just felt like this was a big empty spot in my education and in my knowledge. And so that was part of why I wanted to set it when I did.
So the question is your next book about women protagonists, or can you tell us about your next book?
Sure. So I do think about books for a long time. This one I told you, 10 years, Island, Tea-Girl of Hummingbird Lane, 20. This one, 26 years. And 26 years ago, when my grandmother died, I found in her belongings a diary written by her mother, my great-grandmother, who was born on a homestead in South Dakota. The family continued west, homesteaded again in Washington State. She got pregnant very young, had to get married, and she and her husband, my great-grandfather, had very hard lives. I mean, I sometimes think, as I've been working on this, I've given my fictional characters really difficult times, but not like this. And so they were itinerant workers from Alaska down to the Mexican border. And, on the surface, this seems very different from my other books, but I feel like it fits right in. I mean, it is my first 100% sort of American story, but to me, it fits right in the sense that I've been trying to tell these moments through the eyes of women. And just two more things about this. One is this whole idea of westward migration. You go into the frontier, you pioneer, you settle, move on to the next frontier, pioneer, settle, move on to the next. So this push west, 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 west. And all of a sudden people smacked up against the Pacific Ocean. It was like, now what? And clearly my great-grandparents didn't figure out the answer because they kept going up and down and up and down. And then the other thing is that we think we live in a time of tremendous change, and of course we do, but not like this time period where you go from, in a very short time, true pioneer life to having indoor plumbing, electricity, telephones, radio, movies, no television yet, bicycles coming on big, automobiles, airplanes, and then in a more sort of historical level, World War I, the last big pandemic, prohibition, and a woman's right to vote. We just celebrated the 100th anniversary last week. And until whatever it was, 6 months ago, I could say all but one of those things has a direct impact on our lives today. And now it's all of them.
So where did they sell all of the sea harvest? And who consumed the abalone, and who bought the seaweed?
Well, there were different markets for different items. So China bought some things, Russia bought some things, Japan bought some things, mainland Korea. So, you know, there is that part in World War II where they were actually looking for different things to sell to the different countries, because I think it was Japan that the Japanese soldiers, you know, would get a little sea urchin in their daily rations. And in China, you know, they have a lot of dried squid, abalone, you know, a lot of things like that that are just part of the Chinese diet. Different types of seaweed and algae that different countries would use. So they were all different. And then there was also just the local trade of today, certainly to restaurants, but again, still selling to other countries.
So who's doing that kind of harvesting these days, since there are so few?
Women.
Still just the women, or?
Still just the old women. You know, the youngest one now is about 55. The oldest one that I interviewed was in her early, like 93, I'd say.
And we had a comment that someone thinks she had maybe 3 paragraphs about the Korean War in school.
Yeah, that's sort of what I had too. Definitely. And maybe those 3 paragraphs we jumped over anyway. Oh, and I did a question, did I interview any of the men? Yes, I did. And, you know, when I mentioned you're my second book club in 2 hours, so I can't remember what I told you and what I told those. But I think we did talk about the different groups of people and going where the women were going into the sea and coming out of the sea. And there was this one jetty that I would go to, and the men would come at the end of the day to help their wives lift these heavy nets out of the sea. So, you know, these nets, when they're full, they're like this, and they're filled with sea creatures. So, you know, if you've ever carried a bucket of water, you know how heavy water is. Well, these are sea creatures filled with water. And so while the women will carry these on their backs, but it's really the men who lift them out of the, you know, help to, you know, like take 2 or 3 men to lift them out of the water, and then the women put them on their backs. Anyway, so I was on this jetty, and these were not women far out at sea. They were just off the jetty, like 20 feet off the jetty. And the thing is, they're completely covered head to toe. They wear the kind of wetsuit that is, you know, covers their head, so that all it shows is this. Then they've got the mask. Then they've got the snorkel, gloves, flippers. So really no skin showing. And I would ask these men, like, which one is your wife? And they'd say, oh, that one right there. And the way they kept track of which one was their wife was by the sumbasori, the sound they made when they came up. Because each one is unique to each woman. And so that's how they watched to make sure that their wife was safe, and how they tracked her in the water.
Were those sounds different, just like people have different sneezes, or was that a practice of what?
No, I think you're exactly right. And I'm going to use that from now on, like how people have different sneezes.
So I'm profound. Okay, any more questions out there?
Did the info on arranged marriages come from my interviews? Yes, and from research about marriage traditions in Korea, but particularly on Jeju. And there's actually been quite a bit written about that. So I had a lot of different sources, a couple of dissertations that had been written on it, and there's one particular, there are so many scholars and researchers who have been looking at the Haenyeo, whether it's about marriage or there was one woman, a researcher I talked to, who spent the last 40 years finding Haenyeo songs. So, you know, these are people who are very specific in their research, but they're also encyclopedic in what they know. And so I really try to find those people because they've devoted their lives to, you know, some little subject that I'm barely going to mention, but I want it to be accurate.
Okay, and Cindy has another question if you want to unmute yourself.
When did you decide how did you decide and when did you decide the resolution of the conflict between Mija and Youngsuk?
What do you mean?
Well, like,
that
did you do that at the beginning? Did you know that was how you were going to resolve this conflict between these two women? Between Youngsuk and...
So I write, like I said, I write the last line first so that I knew that there was going to be some resolution at the end, and how, you know, and what it involved the sea. But there are other things along the way that took me a while to get to. So I'll give you the two examples, the obvious ones. One is that had to do with the rubbings. And I kept thinking to myself, how can these women preserve moments if they can't write, they can't read, they didn't have a camera, they didn't have an iPhone to take a picture. I mean, you know, how could they do that? And finally, there just came a day when I thought about my grandmother. And my grandmother was really an intrepid traveler. She didn't have a lot of money, but she did really travel. And she would do things like travel through India 3rd class. I mean, she was hardcore traveler. And she was an artist. And so she would, I mean, I just vividly remember this. She'd come home and open her suitcase, and I would unpack these rubbings and open them up. And, you know, as just a little kid, I was being transported to like a temple in Cambodia. And so when I had that thought, it was just so perfect that here was a way they could commemorate these moments, and only the two of them would know what they meant. You know, that these would really mean something to them. And then the other was, it has to do with Clara. And I thought, God, she's just the most obnoxious teenager. With those things in her ears, and she just was, I mean, and that's just a thing that really drives me crazy, is when people just have those things in their ears all the time. And so I just thought she was just so obnoxious. And then, you know, there's the scene at the opening of the memorial, and Youngsuk's kind of overcome and she leaves, and Clara comes after her. And Clara takes the earphones out of her ears and puts them in Youngsuk's ears. I did not know until that moment who was on the other side.
Well, I personally thought it was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I just didn't know. So, you know, I was just like, really? I mean, I was, wow. Made me think very differently about Clara. But I still think
Yeah.
was being kind of obnoxious at the beginning, and then you have this real change of, I mean, I hope people have a change of heart about her.
Well, there were lots of changes of heart in the book, and I appreciated all of them. Thank you.
And we have a question about the population of Jeju in the period that you wrote about, and has it changed today?
Huge difference. So today there are over 600,000 people live there. And back, I'm trying to remember, I think I even say it in the book or in the acknowledgements. I think going into the 4/3 incident, it was around 200,000. Between 30 and 80,000 were killed, but then a huge number left, escaped and went to Osaka in Japan. So it was immediately after that, so, in the 1950s, that the population was somewhere around 100,000.
Well, we've been enjoying our tea and our little rice cookies tonight.
I'm so glad.
Drinking at their own locations. And Nancy, I will get back to you on where I got that tea.
And I just want to tell you, I don't know if you guys read Tea Girl of Hummingbird Lane, but the person I traveled to China with has her own tea company. And so she created this tea tasting package for book clubs, which turned out to be very successful. And then when this book was coming out, she introduced me to her friend, who is a Korean tea master who lives in Los Angeles. But in her family, it's generations of tea masters going back to the year 858. So it was so interesting. Her name is Yun Hee, and it was so interesting to go to her house, and her whole house is about tea. And she teaches classes and does seminars, and she's just like this international, she travels all around the world. She's this international tea expert. And she put a lot of thought into what teas we could have. The one that I really had hoped to include was mugwort, because there's a lot of mugwort in the book, but it's very, very expensive. And so it just wasn't going to come in at the right price. But then just the last thing I'll say about the teas is that Korea doesn't actually have a history of like traditional tea plants, because the country was so poor for so long. And so they were making tea out of whatever they could find. So that, mugwort, I saw somebody, what was it, magnolia, the barley, that these are things that people just had and weren't too expensive. And so tea, the tea like we think of tea leaves, that's really pretty recent, more like actually came with the Japanese during the Japanese colonial period. So really over only the last 100 years. But the other teas are really come out of the culture of just being so poor and using what's around you and trying to find the things that are tasty. And anyway, I had wanted to include the mugwort, but it's just too expensive to be able to have it in there.
Well, one person has said the barley tea is very interesting and delicate. And I myself did the barley tea iced. So,
that's very popular, iced barley tea, especially in the summer. And but I've always liked it in the winter, that it has that kind of warm, cozy feel. Would have been perfect for today while it was snowing here.
Well, I actually steeped it yesterday when it was a lot hotter than it was today. So, that's what I did. A question about, has Jeju Island become an international tourist destination, and is it becoming much more corporate involvement?
Well, I never saw McDonald's and I never saw Starbucks. I think they're pretty careful about letting companies like that on there. I don't think they have something like a Hilton, but they do have big resorts, like you find in Hawaii. I mean, whether it's a big resort with a big golf course or multiple golf courses. But I don't think of it as being too corporate there. But I also don't know all of the Asian chains either. Like hotel chains, I don't know them all. Or any one, Aman. That's the only one I know.
And I believe
I don't think Aman is there.
that Nancy Holt has been to Jeju Island. Is that correct, Nancy? You're muted. Okay.
Yeah, I have. Probably about, I don't know, 8 or 10 years ago. Our son worked in Korea and we went down with him to Jeju. And Lisa's description of the island is very good. We did stay in a Hyatt, I think, resort. But we had our own car, and Greg, we could use the Korean GPS. He had a slight mastery of the language. And we found it fascinating. But after reading this book, what has humbled me is that I had no idea about the massacre. And I'm wondering back then what guidebook I was reading, or if I didn't read the history.
But it probably wouldn't have been in a guidebook, because remember, it's 50 years of silence.
That's true.
It was really only at about 2008.
Yeah, well, that's
today. If you do a search on the internet, you'll find some things, but not very much.
I was just amazed. And then I was also impressed. We did visit a tea plantation, but it was very sophisticated, and as you said, a more recent endeavor for them. And I remember, and it's so Korean in nature, all these little museums for just everything you can think of. It's just
crazy museums there.
Yes, it's just hysterical. And going up on the volcanoes and hiking and seeing the women, we did go do that. It was all very, very interesting. And your description was very good. So it was interesting to read the book from that point of view, but I really felt I learned so much more about the history and really appreciated that.
Thank you.
Questions out there?
Well, I did have one. Am I still?
Yes,
One.
go ahead.
It's been an hour already.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, but the last one.
Well, am I on?
Yes.
Yes, okay. We talk about the dying out of the culture. It seems to me, I saw something recently that they were trying to establish a school to
They
train.
have a school.
Is
They
that
do.
successful?
It's interesting. It's mostly foreigners who go.
Oh, okay.
It's primarily expats who are like, oh, I'll do this for 3 months or, a year. I know a couple of people who've done it. There are a few young women who are diving. Most of them are like young mothers. And here's the thing about this job. It's really like quarter time, right? It's only 14 days out of the month, half days, and they're not doing that itinerant work.
Mm-hmm.
And so doing that, they can make about the equivalent of about $30,000 US a year, which on that island can go a really long way. I mean, not if you're staying in a resort, but if you're just living in a stone cottage, that could go a long way. But nevertheless, it's still, probably like less than 10.
Yeah, I just wondered if that would really work.
But the school looks fun, and but it's, like I said, it's mostly for expats who live there.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, I should jump off because it's been an hour, but thank you all so much. Thank you for organizing everything, Beverly. Everybody thank her. And hopefully we'll get to do this again one of these days. And in the meantime, please stay safe, please stay healthy.
Well,
Thank you.
we very much appreciate you doing this for us. And I have to tell you, I got so many responses about everybody loving the book that it was, we're happy you joined us. We're happy we read the book. It was a positive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now,
All right. Bye-bye. Good night.
Lisa's gonna
Thank
leave,
you.
but everybody else hang around for a little bit. I need to do something.
Okay.
So I think she's gone. We are doing, the board decided this year to do a drawing at each of our programs to support independent and minority businesses in our community. So tonight we have a gift certificate to the Longs Peak Grocery Market, which is on Francis Street between, well, it is at 1125 Francis Street, and it's an Asian market. So that's who it was tonight. All of you are in my basket. And Janelle gets the certificate. I will get this to you, Janelle. Do I see you out there? So anyway, that's just a minor, I mean, we'll be doing this more often through the year. And if you have any businesses that you think of that are like little pockets of neighborhoods, let us know and we'll add them to our list.
Is there going to be another book for next month or no?
This one was a special book, Cheryl. It was designed to be an all branch read because there are more people attending than normally come to our book club. Originally, we were going to do this in April and we were going to serve the tea at, have tea pots going around doing the tea. It just got delayed. But the book club does meet the third Thursday of every month. So I don't know what the third Thursday is. I think it's like the 17th, something like that. We're doing a book called The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter by Helen Gaynor.
Yeah, we read that in another book club I'm in. Fine. Okay.
So I'll make sure you get that information and so that you can know about that. And then we have books going out for like 3 months at a time.
Okay, great.
Probably won't
Thanks.
have, well, I'll get you information about
Yeah.
that.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
So does anyone else have anything they wanted to discuss about the book or? Or are we finished for the evening?
Bev, I think we need to give you a wonderful, wonderful applause or whatever we can do on Zoom, because what a fabulous job you've done putting this all together. And I know it took a lot of stress and a lot of emails and a lot of planning to make it work, but it was really, really wonderful. And doing it on Zoom is not like we can all be together and pass our teacups around, but it was certainly a very, very worthwhile experience. So thank you so much from everybody who was here and from the whole branch. What a fabulous job.
Yes,
Thank
we-
you, Bev.
Thank you. It was awesome.
I noticed that the question about not knowing much about the Korean War, and that's what everyone I've talked to says, that we, our generation really doesn't, because we were just too little, and it didn't involve our parents very much. And so that was, to me, very important because then maybe I will be reading more things about the Korean War.
My dad was in the Korean War, and I think because it was, well, he was there before Korea, but it was called a conflict for a while too. So there's
Yes.
these conflicting things going on with how it was termed as well.
I remember that my cousin, who was in the Korean conflict, was not eligible to join the Veterans of Foreign War because it was not a declared war, and he couldn't join the group.
Mm.
So. Okay, well, I think that kind of finishes us for the evening. Paula, we're happy you could join us.
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
And I will be sending a reminder about book club, which is basically next week. So
Can I just
Okay.
remind everybody?
we'll talk
if
to you all
haven't-
later.
You haven't signed up for fall leadership, there's still a couple of days left. So I think we're getting a pretty good attendance, and I'm really anxious to see that.
Well, and Paula, let me say that I will be sending out additional information with an email blast about not only the leadership conference tomorrow, and also for all of us, we have a fall kickoff on Monday night. That is unfortunately going to be on Zoom, but it's a happy hour. So, you know, bring your favorite happy beverage and whatever snack you'd like at 5 o'clock on Monday, after you do the leadership conference on Saturday morning.
Great. That's wonderful, Wanda.
All right. Thank you,
Thanks
Bev.
again,
Yeah.
Bev.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.